Hello, I'm Alistair Hudson. The purpose of this podcast is to explain dispositions of an equitable interest under section 53(1)(c) of the Law of Property Act 1925 and all the case law that's followed on from those lovely things. So I'm going to try and draw the diagrams in front of you and try and explain in less than 10 minutes how all of these cases function. So let's remind ourselves of the problem. We're concerned with a situation in which there is a disposition of an equitable interest, because when there is a disposition of an equitable interest, or any interest under a trust, that requires signed writing under section 53, subsection 1, paragraph C of the LPA 1925. So we're going to look at the cases in diagrammatic form which have followed on from that. We're going to start with Gray and the IRC. And we're going to start with a man called Hunter, who wanted to benefit his 6 grandchildren's settlements. Let's just number them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. He had 5 living grandchildren, and he had a 6th settlement created for any grandchildren as yet unborn. These settlements were created in 1949, and then in 1955, Hunter decided that he wanted to try and transfer some valuable shares, 18,000 of them, to his grandchildren. The trouble was, if he had simply transferred them outright by way of a gift, then that would have required signed writing in the form of a stock transfer form. So what Hunter's advisors suggested that he do was this. They advised that he create a trust. So we have trustees who already hold property on trust for these grandchildren under the various settlements, and these trustees become trustees over the shares in favour of Hunter in 1955. The plan was that Hunter would give a verbal instruction to his trustees that instead of holding these shares on trust for Hunter in the future, they would instead hold them for the 6 grandchildren. Now, the analysis of this decision that we get from reading Vandervell and the IRC, which is a House of Lords case that follows on after this, is that the trustees must have stayed in the same place, and that all that happened here was that an equitable interest was transferred from Hunter to the 6 grandchildren settlements. So the way in which we should think about this, I would suggest, is in the following way. We should think about it as being a case in which the trustee stayed in the same place. The trustee who was holding for Hunter. It's quite odd watching your own handwriting through a tiny screen on a flip video. And that what happened instead was that this equitable interest is transferred to the 6 grandchildren settlements and is held on trust by the trustee. So the key thing is that we have a trustee holding on trust for beneficiary 1, and then that equitable interest is transferred to beneficiary 2. That is a disposition of an equitable interest, because all that's moved here is the equitable interest going from beneficiary 1 to beneficiary 2. That's a disposition. Now, Viscount Simons in Gray and the IRC is very clear. The disposition should just be given its natural meaning, and as far as his lordship was concerned, the equitable interest started here, it ended up here, therefore it has been disposed of. And he thought the case was a very simple one. Things get more complicated or are made more complicated when we talk about Vandervell and the IRC. So we have Mr. Vandervell, who has, again, valuable shares held on trust for him by VT Co. Okay, that's supposed to say Vandervell. He wanted to benefit the Royal College of Surgeons. Time of very high taxation, what was decided was we should transfer some shares that are held on trust by VT Co. for Vandervell. We should transfer those shares to the Royal College of Surgeons, declare a dividend over those shares in that 1 year, sufficient to found a chair of pharmacology in the Royal College of Surgeons. And there's still an enormous amount of stuff there that bears Vandervell's name in the Royal College of Surgeons. They have a Vandervell lecture theatre and all sorts. So, how does this function? Well, Vandervell gives an instruction to take his equitable interest. Let's show this in terms of the green line. So that equitable interest is to pass out to the Royal College of Surgeons. But along with the equitable interest goes the legal title. And that's the important point here. We are transferring legal and equitable together. And it's held by the House of Lords in Vandervell and the IRC that if you transfer the legal and the equitable title together, then there is no need to satisfy the separate formality in section 53(1)(c). So let's draw that again to make the particular point from Vandervell. If you have your equitable interest held on trust for B1 by, let's call that person trustee 1, if we transfer that legal title together with the equitable interest into a situation in which we therefore have trustee 2 holding on trust for beneficiary 2, then in that circumstance we have taken the equitable interest from B1, trustee 1 has then transferred the legal title, the orange line, and the equitable interest, the green line, together onto a brand new trust, so that trustee 2 is holding for beneficiary 2. That is not a disposition of an equitable interest. It is said because it is a transfer both of legal title and equitable interest together. So, as a result of Vandervell and the IRC, all that we're concerned about in the Gray and the IRC case are situations in which the equitable interest passes on its own, because in this example the legal title has stayed in the same place. We haven't transferred the legal title from this trustee to new trustees. Instead, the legal title has stayed in the same place, a bit like a pendulum in an old grandfather clock. Yeah, that's fixed at the top, and we just have the equitable interest swinging around at the bottom. That's the disposition of an equitable interest after Vandervell and the IRC, because in Vandervell and the IRC we're told if legal and equitable title move together, section 53(1)(c) doesn't have to be satisfied. Part of the rationale that's suggested for that is that if you've satisfied a formality for transferring the legal title, why should you have to satisfy a separate formality for transferring the equitable interest? There's no need. My personal view is, how do you know that you have transferred the legal and the equitable interest together unless there's some proof of it? It's just returning to exactly the same problem. The whole point of section 53(1)(c) is to provide evidence of who owns the equitable interest from time to time. And if we're simply saying we're assuming that legal and equitable have moved together, or we know, well, can that be proved? And so I would suggest that Vandervell and the IRC doesn't necessarily get out the mischief of section 53(1)(c). Whereas here, the Gray and the IRC point, something slightly different is going on. Viscount Simons is suggesting in Gray and the IRC that what's going on there is that it's the signed writing which actually carries out the transfer. Now that, I would suggest, is something more than mere evidence, but there we are. There are other clever ways of trying to get around 53(1)(c). Let's have a situation in which we have a trustee holding on trust for a mother. In Oughtred and the IRC, that word is supposed to say mother, and another trustee holding on trust for her son, such that mother and son hold valuable shares in their separate trusts. And the idea was to consolidate all of the shareholding in the mother of the shares which the son held. So the son holds some B shares, the mother holds A shares. What was decided here was that the mother and son would create a contract between them. Okay. Sorry, difficult to hold the video camera and write, whereby the son would transfer the B shares to the mother's trust, and the mother would transfer the A shares to the son's trust. Because, using modern constructive trust language now, it would be unconscionable, Neville and Wilson, for the mother to deny the shares to the son and the son to deny the shares to the mother. It said that by constructive trust, that equitable interest transfers automatically, and therefore there is no need for signed writing under section 53(1)(c).